Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on International Women's Day. My name is Hilit Zwick, and I'm the U.S. Executive Director of the Alliance for Israel's Future. Today's webinar, Power and Possibility, Women's Leadership in the U.S. and Israel Today, is co-sponsored by Partners for Progressive Israel and the Alliance for Israel's Future. I am very pleased to have with us today two formidable women as our guests. Jane Eisner, editor-in-chief of the Forward newspaper, who's calling in from New York, and Nomi Chazan, former deputy speaker of the Knesset, who's calling in from Jerusalem at this late hour. I will introduce each of them in a bit more detail in just a moment. As a side note, as you will probably see, we've had some technical difficulties, so you will not be able to see Nomi Chazan on the call, but you will be able to hear her, and she will be able to respond to questions as we move through the call. We apologize for this snafu. In terms of a format, we'll have a discussion in the first part of the call, and I will leave the last 15 and 20 minutes for Q&A. Callers can type in their questions, and you'll see a Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen. You can type the questions in as we're speaking, and I'll read the questions when we get to the Q&A session. Feel free to direct your questions to either one speaker or the other, or both. Having said that, though they likely need no introduction, I do want to tell you a bit more about our two speakers today. Jane Eisner, a pioneer in journalism, became editor-in-chief of The Forward in 2008, the first woman to hold this position at an influential Jewish national news organization. Under her leadership, The Forward readership has grown significantly and has won numerous regional and national awards for its original journalism, in print and online. Jane's editorials have also won national and regional awards. She is a frequent commentator on radio and television and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, WNYC, and other stations around the country and the world. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
Nomi Chazan, former Knesset deputy speaker and leading human rights activist, served as president of the New Israel Fund from 2008 to 2012. She is professor emerita of political science and African studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she served as chair of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace. She has also been a visiting professor of government at Harvard University. Nomi is currently dean of the School of Government and Society at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo and director of the Center for the Advancement of Women in the Public Sphere at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. Welcome, Nomi.
Well, thank you.
To start us off, I want to acknowledge that though we face enormous challenges both in Israel and in the US in terms of political leadership, I am pleased to say that on this International Women's Day, we find ourselves in the midst of a significant and positive change in the status of women, the visibility and representation of women, and the support network that has developed among women and their allies in response to our challenging political surroundings and the Me Too movement. On a leadership level, a record number of women are running for office in the US. And just to give an example, the number of Democratic women likely challenging incumbents in the House of Representatives is up nearly 350% from 41 women in 2016. And in Israel, there are 34 women now serving in the legislature, making up more than a quarter of all Knesset members. Women in the US and in Israel have made important advances in many fields, including education, law, political representation, and the media. However, restrictions to women's rights have also been given new primacy in our current political discourse in both countries. In the US, we're seeing proposals to limit women's access to abortion and healthcare. And in Israel, we've witnessed public calls from a number of influential rabbis instructing their students not to enlist in the IDF because of its mixed gender service and the integration of women into combat units. On this note, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers to hear from them. And I want to ask each to begin by making remarks about the status of women and women in leadership from their own position and experiences. And Jane, I'd like to begin with you. Can you give us an overall picture of women in leadership today with a particular emphasis on what is happening with women in the American Jewish community. As many of us know, you publish an annual salary survey in the foreword, which speaks to the gender gaps in leadership. And I wonder if you could share with us some of the other trends that you're seeing.
Thank you, Hilit. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be part of a conversation with Naomi Chazan. So thank you all. There is no doubt that this is an auspicious day, and I do think that the climate for the conversation is changing dramatically. However, there are systemic and real challenges to women in leadership that I feel have been persistent and really deserve attention. So I've been editor of the Forward for nearly 10 years. And when I got here to New York, I had come from Philadelphia, where I was very much involved in women's leadership there. And so I asked, who are the women in charge of the American Jewish world, the organizations? Where are they? And it was really hard to find them. I literally found myself writing notes to different women who I saw quoted in stories to ask, can I meet them? And it got me wondering, what is in fact going on with our institutions? The great thing about being a journalist, you get to ask questions and then try to find the answers. So that's when we first started doing what has now become the salary survey. This was in 2009, started in a much smaller way, but we began by asking two basic questions. Who's in charge, male or female, and how much do they make? We compiled a list of about 75 organizations. It's grown a little bit, shrunk a little bit as things have changed in three general categories. The federation system, and they have their own sort of designation in the United States of the large federations, service and advocacy groups, and then religious and education groups. We are stymied to some degree because many religious groups hide behind the law and do not reveal their salary information because they don't have to. But for all the other groups, this information is available. It's just hard to find. It's hard to verify. And no other organization had ever put it together so that you could actually compare it. And so what we have found over the years, we just published our most recent salary survey in December of 2017. And what we found has been, frankly, remarkably similar and therefore rather depressing. The number of women in charge of these organizations has stayed roughly the same. It's about 11, 12, 14, but just really very roughly the same. And the salaries are much lower than the men's salaries at around 60 cents for every dollar. Now, some of that is because women tend to be in smaller organizations that tend to pay less. And in fact, we rank them according to salary, and I think this year it took to be 24 before there was a woman. But even when you factor out the size of the organization, women are earning only about 80 cents for every dollar that men earn when they run these organizations. And there's some really glaring problems that we have found. For example, in the federation system. Among the large federations, there is only one woman in charge of the major federations. So let's just stop and think about this for a minute. There are more American Jewish women on the United States Supreme Court than there are running a major federation in America. And we also just see that many of the other large and still influential groups of the legacy organizations are run by men, oftentimes the same men for many decades, and very often when they are replaced, when they finally retire, they're replaced by another man. Now, there are limitations to our survey. It doesn't include every organization, it can't. And we also aren't looking deeper into the organizations, to the number 2 and the number 3 and the number 5, to see if there's a leadership pipeline. But we do know that among Jewish charities in America, about 75% of the workforce is women, And certainly among the large national organizations, less than 20% of the leadership are women. So we definitely have an issue here. What's being done? I think I'd just like to point briefly to two things. The first is that this problem, and I do think it is a serious problem for all of us, because we're not pulling leadership from all the community. We're only pulling leadership from half the community in most cases. So this problem has come to the attention of serious people, and there is now much more of an attempt to provide a pipeline for very talented up-and-coming leaders, women and men, and I think a lot of really good efforts along those lines. And secondly, I think it also points to the fact that many of these legacy organizations are, I hate to say it, but they're just simply not as important and as relevant as they used to be. And what I am seeing, and the thing that makes me so heartened on this Women's Celebration Day, is to see the rise up of great women leaders from all over the country in less expected places. They might be the kinds of leaders that are the heads of organizations that are the biggest and most well-paid, but still have a lot of impact. And they're really bringing a lot of vibrancy to those organizations. We find, I think, tremendous rabbinic leadership among women in America now. I'm thinking of people like Angela Buckdahl, Central Synagogue in New York, Sharon Brous at ICAR. I'm thinking of women like Susan Talvi, the rabbi in St. Louis, who was so instrumental in bringing that community into the conversation about Ferguson and the conversation about civil rights and what's going on in the African American community, and so many others. I mean, I feel badly about naming just a few because I don't want to be perceived as leaving out so many others who are doing really, really good work. And so I think the conversation is going to shift to see those women emerge and be heard and get the audience that they deserve. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that a lot of communal money and a lot of communal power is still invested in these legacy organizations that, for the most part, tend to be run by the same people, and those same people tend to be white men. And that's still a big challenge for the American Jewish community. I should probably stop there and turn it over to Naomi.
Healy, do you want me to just jump in? Healy?
Healy, we can't hear you.
Can you hear
Sorry.
me?
Yes, Nomi, we can hear you. I apologize for that. I was on mute. And Nomi, Jane, thank you so much. And Nomi, I'm going to turn it over to you right now to tell us about the status of women in Israel, what trends you're seeing, and whether there's anything to note over the past couple of years with the rise of the Me Too movement.
With pleasure, and I would like to return the compliment and say that it really is a pleasure to appear with Jane Eisner, and I thank her also for the actually quite troubling picture as she presented in her initial presentation. I'll start with the puzzle, because I think the puzzle is what we have to deal with. There have been improvements in Israel and the United States in the status of women, and some of them have been very impressive improvements. More women in the workplace, more women, as you mentioned, Healy, in the Knesset now. There are 34 women. It's over a quarter of the members of the Knesset. You find women in every key position in the country, in law schools, medical schools in Israel. Women are easily 50%, and things look good. The only, well, on the other hand, and here's the paradox, as the status of women improves, the status of men improves even more. And as a result of that, the gap between men and women has remained constant in Israel. We've measured it at the Center for Women in the Public Sphere at the Van Leer Institute, and our major publication, which is the Gender Index, and we find that in almost every sphere of life, the gaps between men and women are constant. In other words, we're moving forward, but we're not closing the gaps. The gaps are not narrowing. And in some areas, they're actually very, very troubling. So I'll just reel off some statistics in order to give everybody a sense of the gaps that we're talking about, despite the major advances that have been mentioned. The gap, income gap between men and women is now 32%. It, by the way, went up last year a little bit. That means women make 68 agorot for every shekel that a man makes. Israel just announced the Israel Prizes for the 70th year of Israel's independence, and to date, only one woman has been awarded the Israel Prize for this upcoming year, and she was awarded the prize with her husband. Women appear in the news only 24% of the time, when men appear 76% of the time. Their visibility is just not there. I'll give you another example. It may seem a little odd, but it's very telling. On the pop charts, the song charts in Israel, only on a list, only 17.8% are female performers, as opposed to 82.2% of men. Now, what does this mean? This is a very clear indication of an attempt to silence women for religious reasons in the public sphere. And this is where we get religion encroaching into Israeli life. And in the power sphere, it's nice to talk about 34 women in the Knesset, but that's a descriptive representation. They're biologically female. But the real question is a substantive question. Is this representation really a representation of feminist values, of feminist outlooks, of diverse groups of women in the country? And really, if you press me very hard, I think I could count 5 or 6 women who are truly and proudly feminist in Israel today, that in the Knesset. Now, there's a real gap between descriptive and substantive representation. Excuse me. And the most important thing, perhaps, is in the whole power domain, if we add women in industry and in the private sector, the greatest gap between men and women is in positions of power. It's structured, and Israeli society is very gendered. So we have a problem, and we have to confront it. I'll stop here, and we can continue the conversation.
Naomi, thank you so much. So my first follow-up question to both of you, and Jane, maybe I'll turn it over to you, is what do you see as a woman who is sitting in a position of power and influence? What do you see as a way of bringing on some of the change that is needed to close the gaps and the persistent gaps that both you and Naomi had described?
Oh gosh. Well, I think there are small things, gestures, but they're important gestures that that ought to happen. For a long time now, myself and other people have been saying, anytime there are public programs, a woman should be a part of one, and not just as a token. I think that if we're talking about having conversations, we should include as many people as possible. We try really hard here to make sure that there are women's voices heard at the Forward. We have to promote women. My boss is a woman. The publisher CEO of the Forward, Rachel Fishman Feddersen, has been in her job for about a year and a half. And this is the first time that we have had all the three major editors at the Forward, myself, the editor of the Yiddish Forward, and our publisher, all women. Really, really important. I think there need to be women involved in search committees. I think there needs to be ways in which, when you are interviewing people for key jobs, make sure there are women there. I don't believe that a woman is intrinsically better at a job, but nor is a man. And let's just make sure that we are casting a really wide net. And then I think that we have to recognize the deeper issues that Naomi referenced, which is that we have to examine what is happening in our organizations that make it difficult for women to succeed. And whether it's the workplace environment, family leave policies. Of course, the United States lags terribly behind Israel when it comes to family leave, to healthcare, to the kind of impediments that men and women face, but oftentimes women face them more directly than men do. I know this. I mean, I've been a working mom all my life, raised 3 kids, and didn't sleep much. And now I see what the women around me face, and the men too. And on the one hand, there's tremendous progress. I mean, all the men who work for me are used to having a woman boss. Like, this is new. We can't take this for granted. This is real, and it's important. At the same time, I run a small nonprofit, and we live in a country that makes it really difficult for people to take leave when a new child is born, or a child is sick, or a parent needs care. And those things really, I think, harm women's advancement and the advancement of men too. The key here, as Shifra Brosnik has said for many years, is to look for ways in which systemic change can happen and to find the men who will be allies in that change. And I do think it's happening, but not fast enough.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And just as an added note, for those of you who don't know, Shifra Brosnik has been committed to the advancement of women in the professional world, the Jewish professional world, for many, many years.
Yes.
So thank you for noting that. Naomi, I'd like to turn the question over to you and ask you what your thoughts on how those gaps can be further closed. And I also want to ask you whether there is a particular arena in which you do see women advancing in Israel. As Jane noted, the pulpit is one of the places where in the U.S. we are seeing women rise quite prominently, and I'm curious to know if there is such an equivalent in Israel.
By the way, I wish that women would advance in the pulpit in Israel, but unfortunately, that's not happening at the moment. Quite the contrary. Most women can't get near a pulpit, let alone the Western Wall pulpit. But that's a connected issue. I really agree with everything that Jane said, but I would press much harder and maybe even give a name to a strategy. I think that we've spent an enormous amount of time justifiably on eliminating gender discrimination and on helping women advance. The 2 very clear stages of the work of the last 2-3 decades. But now we have to focus on a slightly different question, or maybe it's not slightly different, it's substantially different, and that is, how do we close gender gap And once we think about closing gender gaps, we're actually focusing directly on social change, on achieving equality, on achieving justice, and achieving social justice. And in other words, we have to start dealing with the deep structures that have perpetuated and continue to perpetuate the real gap. Some of them, by the way, are in our broad cultures in Israel and in the United States, and some of them are distinctly part of the Jewish culture as well, which has not yet overcome the gender gap in any profound kind of way. Now, the key instrument for doing that as a strategic instrument, would be gender mainstreaming. That means bringing gender perspectives and representation and implications into every single question that comes on our agenda. So that if we're talking about increasing employment, we have to think in very strong gender terms. We have to broaden the conversation to bring women in. I would transfer very quickly to the United States. Most of the discussions on Jewish continuity that I've heard have actually been conducted by men. Well, that's not a way of bringing about serious change. So gender mainstreaming implies representation, inclusion of women's perspectives, and thinking of every decision in terms of its gender ramifications. We're beginning to work on that. We're doing it now for the national budget. How does the budget affect women as opposed to men? In many, many ways, nobody asks the question. You don't ask the question. You get the result of perpetuation. One thing that perhaps presses the need to change strategies more than anything is that Israel is a country where the majority of the best trained human resources are women. There is a majority now of college graduates and graduate school graduates, including PhDs, over 50% are female. But women are not translating their educational advantage into income, promotion, and frankly, influence and power. So I agree entirely with Jane that the work-life balance issues are very, very important, but so are the questions of how to bring about a more fundamental change so that the private sphere is not only associated with women and the public sphere is not only male-dominated.
Thank you, Naomi. So before I ask each of you my next question, I do want to remind the attendees that you can start typing in your questions. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a small button that says Q&A. Feel free to type those in and send them along. I would like to actually turn the conversation a little bit to the Me Too movement and the impact of the Me Too movement. I mentioned it a few times in the introduction to the call. Many of us were obviously intensely disappointed not to see female leadership in the White House in 2016, but it seems that out of this disappointment, some kind of energy did formulate around the Me Too movement. I wanted to ask each of you how you see this movement in the context of each of the communities in which you live, and whether there's a potential to actually change things on the leadership level. And Jane, I'll turn the question over to you first.
Oh, thank you. It's really a tough one. There's no doubt that the conversation has changed and that stories are being shared that never were. I mean, I feel that way about my own experiences that I've written about, and I know many, many others. And there's real consequences. And, frankly, people who have abused other people have lost their jobs. They've lost their television show or their film directing spot. And there really are consequences, and I think that is important. And while I don't want to see anyone unfairly punished, I think the fact that there are these real life consequences makes a difference here. Whether or not this is going to create bigger change is still what we still have to see. I mean, there are some terrific people in the American Jewish community who are promoting conversation, National Council of Jewish Women first among them. There are groups of people who are trying to look at policies in workplaces to make sure that that policies against sexual harassment are in place, that they're enforced. All of that, I think, is really important. But I'm afraid that we still have a situation where Jewish institutions tend to want to protect their own. And I see this, in the nuts and bolts of our reporting. We certainly have been looking at different allegations that people have against different leaders. We are always extremely careful as journalists to report these things out. We don't just take one anonymous source and put up a story online. We have to be very careful. And what we're finding is that there still is a great deal of hesitancy by women to come forward, and to come forward in a way that makes the information usable. And I would never in a million years want to pressure a woman to do something that she didn't want to do. But the fact that we know that there are stories out there, and we know that there are women who are afraid to tell them publicly, tells you that there is still a well-founded fear that there will be repercussions that can hurt them, and that the institutions will rally around. And we've seen this in the past. The Forward, I'm very proud to say, has done some really serious reporting over the years about sexual abuse and cover-ups. I'm thinking of the work we did in 2012 and 2013 to show what was going on at Yeshiva University High School, and with two rabbis there in particular, and scores of young men whom they hurt, and the attempts by the administration there over years and years to not confront it, to hide it, to even help these people get new jobs. And so we haven't seen anything like that quite right now, but I know that it exists. And so I feel that even though the conversation has changed, and even though we're part of the bigger world, and there have been plenty of Jews who have been caught up in Me Too and have been sort of forced to pay for it, I don't see major changes yet in the way our institutions are functioning that allow for the stories to come forth, and therefore for new kind of arrangements to be made.
Thank you, Jane. And Nomi, I want to turn it over to you. How are you seeing the impact of the Me Too movement in Israel?
I once again, actually, it's a pleasure. I agree with Jane. The Me Too movement got transferred to Israel, I think, within 24 or 48 hours, and it started with several women television presenters who simply got on and said, so and so harassed me 20 years ago when he was interviewing me for my first job on television. And some men actually were forced to resign as a result. And then there was an outpour. If you look at the social networks, really, the Me Too movement in the U.S. inspired Israeli women, by the way, including Arab citizens of Israel, to come out and talk about their experiences. From that perspective, I would say Me Too has been a tremendously empowering phenomenon for Israeli women of all walks of life. But the question is, empowerment is one thing, and translating that empowerment into power is a different issue. Last week we marked 20 years to a sexual harassment law, which was passed when I was in the Knesset, and really is one of the most progressive sexual harassment laws in the democratic world, and the model has been used. The attempts to implement it have been fairly successful, but they have not really dealt with the heart of the problem. And in Israel, I think it's easier to pinpoint the difficulties, because the two areas where the Israeli women's experience is unique are areas that are they are so patriarchal. And the one is monopolistic religious authorities, Orthodox religious authorities, unfortunately. And that's why, by the way, the pushback among Orthodox women is part of a very intriguing feminist surge in Israel. And the second is everything to do with women in the military. Both the rabbinate and the IDF are almost by definition male-dominated institutions. They're very patriarchal. But if I could point to one other thing, I think Me Too in the States and the new empowerment in Israel as a result of the Me Too example from the United States are part of something else in our democracies. I think both Israel and the U.S. are undergoing a very severe democratic slippage, or if you will, democratic recessions. And when democracy starts falling apart, one of the first victims are women and the status of women in that society. Illiberal countries are more patriarchal, they are more sexist, they tend to be more ultra-nationalist, and they sometimes tend to be racist. And all of those elements are elements that directly affect the status of women and directly affect how others or key elements in society see women and treat women. And I think there's almost a direct connection today between feminism and the need to rehabilitate basic elements of our democracies.
Thank you, Nomi. I'd actually like to ask you a follow-up question on this, and then also ask Jane a similar question. Are you, through the Me Too movement and other grassroots feminist movements, seeing any stronger of a connection between diverse groups within Israeli society? You had mentioned Arab women, ultra-Orthodox women. Are you seeing a stronger connection between various groups and an ability to gain some power and momentum from that connection?
Now, what I'm seeing are two trends. One trend is an increase in the number and the activism of diverse groups of women, Mizrahi women, Orthodox women, ultra-Orthodox women, Ethiopian women, Arab women, Bedouin women, within the Palestinian-Israeli society, Russian-speaking women, you name it. We now have an organization for almost every woman in terms of diversity. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that different women experience aspects of gender inequality in very, very different ways. And I think that's a very important trend, which started about a decade and a half ago. And there's a lot of discussion between the organizations. But that's one trend. A second trend, which itself is also very intriguing, I think that there was a lapse in women's movements on the national level during the past decade until about 2-3 years ago. And now we're seeing the revival of some of the major women's organizations with much stronger positions. For example, the Israel Women's Network, which is the key advocacy group for women in Israel, was a little dormant. Young leadership, by the way, women in their 30s, it's begun to blossom again. It's heard everywhere. They're really amazing. Some of the veteran organizations, like WITO even, came out today, International Women's Day, with a quite effective clip on breaking the glass ceiling. So you see the national organizations, how the two trends merge, I'm not sure yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Jane, what are you seeing in terms both inside the American Jewish community and a diversity of grassroots feminists and women's groups working together? And also you had mentioned the involvement of rabbis in the Black Lives Matter movement and whether there is some connection through the feminist movement over there.
Well, I want to make sure that you understand I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist. So part of this is just what I'm observing. I think that there is a great awakening among young people in America now on a number of fronts. You look at, for example, the leadership of the Women's March, relatively younger women. I think we'll have to see, where this goes. But I'm fascinated to see what is happening out of Parkland, Florida, and the gun control advocates from these victims, survivors of that horrible massacre a few weeks ago, and the energy that they are putting now towards their cause. And I think we see this in a number of ways, and obviously Black Lives Matter was one of them as well. There are tensions, though. We are publishing a bunch of different pieces this week about the issue of one of the leaders of the Women's March and her longstanding affiliation and support for Louis Farrakhan, and women leaders in the progressive movement and beyond that and men and women are sort of debating whether or not there can be room for someone who associates with known anti-Semites in that movement and what that means. So I think that there's a lot of activity and promise, and I think with that flourishing is also comes some really deep challenges to see how these groups are going to find a common cause and find a way to especially include Jewish women.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over now to our Q&A session. I want to encourage the attendees to send in questions. We have a couple of questions that have floated in. The first one is from Lily Rivlin. She asked if both of our speakers can talk about how to bring in young women. She has had success with mentoring, and what do you think? I know that both of you had touched on the presence of a younger generation in these feminist movement, but can you speak to the mentoring aspect and other possibilities of bringing new and younger feminists into the movement? Jane, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you. With respect, it's not my job to bring women into the feminist movement. I do feel it's my obligation, my joy really, to mentor women journalists and to make sure that our newsroom and our profession reflects women and women's stories and experiences and desires. And I'm very proud to say that we have a lot of women working here of many ages. The highest demographic of readers at the Forward are 25 to 34-year-olds. I don't think that there are a whole lot of 120-year-old Jewish institutions that could say that their top demographic is around 30 years old. But I'm very pleased about that, and we know that those readers are not just reading about pop culture, but actually diving into very, very serious issues. So I think it's also a question of elevating those voices to making sure that they are heard. And whether it's the heads of, If Not Now and that movement, or whether it's Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox women. We have a piece on our website today about some of what Naomi was referring to before about the growth of feminist activities among ultra-Orthodox women. So to me, what we should be doing is even more of what we're doing now, which is to make sure that these stories and these voices have a platform and are shared.
Terrific, thank you. And Naomi, what do you think about mentoring and how to bring in and support young women?
Those are two different questions, if I may. First, I spent the entire day today at a gathering of leaders of the National Council of Jewish Women from the United States and leaders of Jewish women foundations at the federations who were in Israel, together with representatives of almost every women's organization in the country, or initiative, by the way. And one of the most striking things and gratifying things about the day was the number of young women. Some of them were very grassroots initiatives, social responsibility, on sexual harassment issues, on running for office at the local level, and some actually leading organizations, as I described before. And these women, many of them have taken courses at the universities in gender studies. Some have majored in gender studies. They've been active in the Army during their service, or at the universities and in gender activities or women's action, and they're bubbling. They're fantastic. They're original. They have lots of terrific ideas. Some of them may need some guidance, and we have to provide the services to do that. Attaching one-on-one mentors may not be the only way to really encourage them. I, by the way, am beginning to think that the best way to encourage a lot of women's initiatives in Israel is to give them the power that comes with money. They spend half their time trying to get grants, even very small grants, to keep themselves floating in order to organize a demonstration or a rally or a vigil or even a symposium. So giving them the boost, there are lots of ways of doing it, and we have to be much more creative. We have to give them resources and knowledge as well.
Thank you, Nomi. So we have another question, which is directed to Nomi. Please comment on the increasing segregation in the army and in higher education in Israel, especially in the context of including the ultra-Orthodox, which also means that women might be pushed to the enclaves. There seems to be a willingness to give up women's rights and place for this kind of inclusion.
Yes, I agree with you. I by the way, am the one who passed the famous law, proposed and passed the famous law on opening up all positions in the military to women. It was the first law passed in the present millennium, actually, the beginning of January 2000. And at the time, there was next to no pushback from religious groups. But in the last 18 years, it's been like a flood. And some of the arguments would really make your hair stand on edge. But leaving that aside, in both the academic world and in the military, the religious groups are trying to create monopolies which have nothing to do with the function of those institutions. Now, the attempt to segregate men and women in academic institutions on the grounds that it's important to maintain respect for their sensitivity neglects the fact that ultra-Orthodox men, Haredi men, are not willing to be taught by females. And that is gross discrimination against women lecturers whose entire careers can be kept back because of this kind of discrimination. All this, by the way, is in the court. A bunch of us have petitioned the High Court on this issue, and it's still being discussed. I think that and pressure in individual colleges and universities may, in most cases, stop this trend. And what's going on in the Army also, it's unpleasant, but it's not going to fly, because the truth of the matter is that women perform some of the most critical roles in Israel's military, especially, by the way, in intelligence and the Air Force. And this attack on women, if it keeps really qualified women away from the Army, is not something that promotes any safety and security in the country. So put it all together, these are dramatic, nasty, sometimes vicious threats to women. It creates a new front that we have to operate on, but I'm not sure that it's going to succeed in any way.
Okay, thank you, Nomi. So we're actually reaching the very end of the hour. We have a few more minutes, and I wanted to just give Jane and Nomi, each of you, an opportunity to just say a few final closing remarks on this International Women's Day. Jane, please go ahead.
Well, I think that this is a very exciting time. I think the challenges are known, but I think that the conversation really has shifted in the last 6 months. I'm very proud to be part of a profession, journalism, that has accelerated that shift. And I now hope that we can use it to actually make the structural changes that we need to make so that we can have a more equitable society.
Thank you. And Nomi, final remarks?
I think these are exciting times. I agree with Jane. I think they're much more challenging than we perhaps realized. And I think it's up to us to act now. I'm talking about us as women, and I think men and women feminists. Because if we don't unite and work together, our societies are going to fall back into places that are dark indeed. So it's exciting, it's challenging, and we have to be very smart and strategic in order to succeed. And anyway, happy International Women's Day.
That's right. Thank you, Nomi, and happy International Women's Day. Thank you, Jane. Thank you both for being such wonderful role models to me and to many, many other women and men and allies all over. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this call. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Laila tov.
Laila tov. Bye-bye.
Bye.